What's good, YouTube? So it's quite a common topic in the online sword community to talk about why exactly does a katana have its curve. There is a reason I've made this little model, which you'll see later on in the video, but sometimes the common explanations are things such as having that slight curve will reduce the surface area in contact with the target, and that it will create a slight natural draw as you cut down. And whilst those effects certainly are real, they are very, very small, and it just doesn't really seem worth it. It doesn't seem worth it when you consider just how much thrusting ability you're going to lose by putting that slight curve into the sword. So why would you choose to make a sword that way? YouTube user I am Shad thinks that it was more of an aesthetic choice than anything else. When you're making a specialised cutting weapon which has a single edge, there's no reason to keep it symmetrical, so why not put a curve onto it to make it look that much nicer? Now, that explanation has never really sat too well with me. It certainly could be a piece of the puzzle, but it just never really seemed complete enough, and I think there's a lot more at play there. Now, when people are talking about the actual physics of the blade, such as the reduction in surface area and all that stuff, a lot of the time it seems that people are talking about it as if the technique being used is just absolutely perfect the whole time, almost like the sword's being used by a machine. And of course reality is a lot muddier, a lot dirtier than that. Things aren't always going to go perfect when you're using a weapon, and here is where I think that the benefits of that curve actually come in. Now, from my own cutting experience and from watching other videos online, I've noticed that katanas tend to be extremely forgiving for poor technique compared with something like a longsword or other straight blades. So it got me thinking that perhaps it has something to do with that. Perhaps that curve actually aids in edge alignment to some degree. And I've found three factors which will aid towards this, and I think these will explain why the curve is a good thing to have on a sword such as this. So, firstly, if we actually look at the shape of it, if we have an axis going through the handle to here, you can see that relative to where you want to be moving the sword, there is a lot of mass and a lot of surface area sitting backwards from that axis. And that, I think, is what makes the katana so much more forgiving when it comes to poor technique. So there's two factors whilst the sword is moving through the air. So first off, if you're applying force this way, so supposing you've got like really terrible edge alignment, it's 90 degrees off, I'm applying force that way or that way, what's going to happen is that I'm accelerating this mass here. This bit of mass here is going to try and play catch up, and it's going to apply torque onto the blade as it comes down. So if we think about that, like if this is a cross section of a katana and here's your edge, if the axis is here and it's going across there, it's going to be pulling up like that as it accelerates. So it's going to do that. Whereas if you've got a sword where the handle is in the centre of mass, you're not going to have any benefit due to acceleration. So there's the first potential benefit which I'd like to test. Secondly, just the surface area. You may be talking 25-30 inches of surface area sitting behind that axis. Most of it is towards the end of the blade, which will be travelling 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, possibly even more, and that is not going to be a trivial amount of wind resistance there, and given how far away it is from that axis, again, that's going to be a fair bit of torque which is going to pull the edge into alignment. Now this will be governed by speed rather than acceleration. So the faster you're moving it, the more wind resistance you're going to have, and the more that's going to be pulling it into alignment. And finally, an analogy for that is effectively that a lot of the blade is acting like the fletchings on an arrow. So an arrow only needs, what's that, an inch and a half, a square inch and a half of surface area there, which is going to hold it straight. Whereas with a sword, you could have maybe 30 square inches of surface area, which will have a pretty big effect. Finally, another factor, with all that mass sitting forward, applying force which is relatively forward of that mass, where you make contact, that should pull the edge into alignment slightly once it's actually made contact. And that does seem consistent with what I've seen in cutting tests. With longswords, if you don't make it all the way through the target you're cutting, it's quite common for the sword to kind of veer off and curve, and then it will very rapidly slow down. Whereas with katanas, if you don't make it all the way through, it's just going to be slowing down as it's cutting through, and the line which you're cutting down is going to stay pretty damn straight. So with that out the way, let's actually test some of these ideas and see what happens on the small scale with this. So the first experiment I ran turned out to be a complete disaster. I spent hours learning how to program a bloody microcontroller, and it turned out that the motor simply wasn't powerful enough. So back to the drawing board. So I ended up cannibalising an old fan to use for the experiment instead. And with this you can see that, yes, the edge certainly does align itself very, very rapidly. I'm filming at 120 frames a second here, so you can actually see what's going on. But judging by how quickly the edge aligns itself, I think that the acceleration is a bigger factor than the speed. It doesn't have very much speed by the time the edge actually aligns it up. So I think it's actually the mass of the blade more than the surface area which has the greatest effect, at least on this small scale. So finally I decided to test how the edge aligns itself after it makes contact with the target, and you can see here that the edge just lines itself up, just like I was saying. It's kind of like the point of the blade which makes contact is like a clothes hanger, and the mass is actually below it. It's like hang some clothes on it. Of course it's going to pull itself straight down. So this is something you can only actually do when you have a single-edged sword. You could do it with a double-edged sword, but it couldn't be symmetrical if you're doing that. If the mass is actually in front of the axis you're moving in, the alignment is actually going to pull itself off as you go. So those are my experiments. I'd quite like to see this done on a larger scale if anybody has the equipment. And I happen to know that a few of my subscribers are blacksmiths and do have access to the equipment to actually do this test on a larger scale. So it would be pretty awesome to see what the results are there. So yeah, in conclusion, on the tests I've done on the small scale, it does seem that having a slight curve in a sword does have a very real effect when it comes to aiding edge alignment, and perhaps this could explain why katanas do have the slight curve that they have. Now, with that all being said, personally, would I prefer a curved sword over a straight sword? No, I wouldn't. If you do have very good technique, then the benefit you get from having that curve is going to be very, very slight. And personally, I don't like losing out on having the decent thrusting ability and the ability to use the other edge of the sword. So I'd personally take a long sword over a katana, even if they were the same length. So those are my thoughts on the subject. Thanks for watching, comment, rate, subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.